In this lesson, I'm going to help you find, download, and install Microsoft SQL Server. This can be a bit tricky, so I'll walk you through it step by step. The way I go about finding the right edition and the right version and all the rest of SQL Server is I go to Google right here and I type SQL Server 2016 Developer Edition. The first link that comes up is this one right here. If you notice, the actual URL says microsoft.com/en-us/SQL Server/SQL Server Editions Developers. And what that is saying this is going to go to the Developer Edition site, which Microsoft is not really great about being clear on what their stuff is and where to get it. So this is actually a really helpful link. I will actually include this link in the notes that we can go right to without having to Google it. But if you ever had to Google it in the future, that's how you do it. Now, once you have clicked on that link, you'll come to this page right here where it says SQL Server 2016 SP1 Developer Edition. In Developer is permissible under it. So we clicked here to sign up for Visual Studio Dev Essentials and Downloads. Now that's a free sign up. You just need a Microsoft account, which any email address will do, and they'll just sign you up for one if you don't have one. Once you click that, you'll come to this page right here. And you'll notice there's a whole lot more than just Microsoft SQL Server here. There's a bunch of other free things you can have access to, including things like Server or Azure, Sync Fusion, Team Services, Visual Studio for Mac. It's a whole bunch of other fun stuff. But right here is Microsoft SQL Server Developer Edition. Click on the download, and you're going to download a 4 megabyte file. All right, and it's going to say something like save as, or cancel, or just start downloading. I will not download that since I've already downloaded it. It's actually on my desktop. And there we go, right here. So if I double click on this and say yes, I have these three options here. Let's start with the option on the left. That's a very simple and clean and quick install with all the basic settings. If this is the first time you've installed SQL Server on your box, that's probably a really quick way to get going. So I would just say go ahead and click this. It's easy, you just push a button and it's done. On the far right, we have download media. That's if you want to install this later and don't want to install it now, or you want to install it on a machine that's not connected to a network. Or you want to install it more than one machine, in which case it makes sense to download it instead of downloading it for each machine. The middle option is one we're going to do today, just so you can see what some of the options are, but you really don't need to do that if you don't want. Like I said, if you're doing it, click on basic. It's the next finish, basically. But I want to show you at least the custom options here. So the first thing is, where should the media download? We'll go ahead and say that's fine. And the download is successful. So now we'll start the installation shortly. All right, we get this screen right here, and this has always been one that has thrown me for a bit of a loop. I'm not sure about you, but I find this a little intimidating to have 18 different options on the first of many tabs or sections. Now, it is nice they group it into planning, installation, maintenance, and tools and all the rest. So I can go, okay, I want installation. But then you go to installation and it's like, okay, now what? So we can choose different editions here, evaluation, developer, and express. We want developer because we want all those tools, and that is free. We hit next. We accept the terms. We want to use Microsoft Update to check for updates. That's going to scan Microsoft to see if there's any updates available that we can install before we even install a server. Okay, so what this is it's going to check your machine to make sure that you have all the necessary things in order for SQL Server to be installed. What all these matter, it's not a big deal. All you really care about is these green check marks. Now, the one that always turns yellow is the Windows firewall. Don't worry about it. You can leave it as it is. But everything else should be green. If it's not, it should tell you how to fix it. And once you do fix it, you can hit the rerun. We'll hit next. Now, here's the next confusing step. What do we install? So let's install the Database Engine service. We don't need replication, R service, full text, data quality, or polybase. We don't need analysis or reporting server. Now, if you want to do an analysis service or reporting service, you could. But I tend to leave those off unless I absolutely need them because they do take up a bunch of extra space. Down here, we could choose all of these if we wanted to, but typically I don't choose anything extra down here. We could add documentation components if you want. There's a little blurb up here about what it is. But typically I just install the Database Engine services. Where the root directory is, that's the default. You can leave that unless you want to change it. We hit next. We wait. Now here's the next question, and that is, what do you want to call this instance of SQL Server? Now what this is asking is, with SQL Server you can have multiple installations on the same machine. And the way we differentiate them is with instance names. So the default instance is typically the one we start with. But you can also have a named instance and give it a name, and then you'll have to reference it dot, slash, and that name, versus the default is just dot. And we'll see that in a little bit when we actually start using SQL Server and connecting to it with SSMS. But for now, we're going to leave the default instance here. On my machine, since I have both 2014 and 2016 installed, I didn't want to mess with trying to upgrade 2014 when I had some things that I was working on right then that I didn't want to locally for just your developer edition, these are all fine the way they are. Same thing with TempDB and FileStream. We can leave all these defaults the way they are. If you're going to be a database administrator, you'd probably come in here and tweak some of these things, especially the initial size of the database and growth for the TempDB. We'd probably change those. But again, developer edition, it's fine. We're not going to enable FileStream for T-SQL access. What that would allow us to do is talk directly to our file server and connect our database to files, and is just not something we're going to get into with our developer edition. Okay, now we're ready for installation. Here's all the settings that have been set up for us. That's great. You can actually look over if you wanted to and make sure that there's nothing else that you want to change or tweak, but I think that looks good. Let's go ahead and hit install. And now I wait for this whole installation to complete. I will actually pause and come back once this is installed. It's just way too long for you just to watch. All right, and we're done. So now it says that everything was successful. We've got the database engine, the SQL browser, the SQL writer, and then set up support files. So we're good there. We hit close. And now we come down to the next item in our list, which is install SQL Server Management Tools. This is SSMS, SQL Server Management Studio is what you want. And it's going to take us here, where we can download it. Isn't that great? So download SQL Server Management Studio, and this current version is 16.5.3. We don't want the release candidate. That's the newest one, but it may not be entirely stable. So I've downloaded it here. So I'll close this out and run this and click install to begin. We say yes to the prompt. We wait for it to load the packages. And now it's going to actually start installing things. So we'll let this run. And now it's complete. So we hit close, and that's pretty simple. I like simple. Okay, so now we need to look for the SQL Server Management Studio. I hit my Windows key and typed SSMS, or you can type out Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. I click this. Might be a good idea to pin that to your taskbar or put it on your desktop or something like that. And let's just make sure that everything installed right and we actually have a database, or at least a database server. So it's going to set up initially. And now it's asking us to connect to a SQL server. Now here's the deal with SSMS versus SQL. We had two different installations, and there's a purpose for that. I really do wish there were one installation, but I understand to an extent. So when we installed our first installation, we were installing the actual database server, the actual database engine. And so that does not really have a front end. That's just a back end thing that runs as a couple of services. And in theory, that plugs away without us even knowing it's there or seeing it. It can run no problem without it. And if you're in a production environment, that's really all you need on the database server itself. But we do need to talk to the database server to say, hey, I want to actually build databases. I want to work with my databases. And that's where the front end comes in, and that's the SQL Server Management Studio. It's how you manage SQL Server. So this is SQL Server Management Studio, and it's saying, which server do I connect to? Because again, these two are disconnected. Even though they're right now on the same machine, it still wants to know which server, because this does not have to connect to this machine. it could connect across the internet to a different box. For example, I sometimes connect to development boxes or development databases that are on Azure or on a different virtual machine somewhere in the cloud. And I connect locally through my local SQL Server Management Studio. In this case, all the defaults will work. So the server name is SQL Demo, and that's just the name of my virtual machine. You can also use dot, that'll work as well, instead of SQL Demo. So I could do that. And then down here, authentication. By default, it says Windows Authentication, which, remember we said that my login, T. Corey, is an administrator on the SQL Server. Or we could say SQL Server Authentication, in which case I would have to put in the SA login and my password. And I have the option then of saying remember password. So let's log in though as my Windows Authentication. Options, typically we don't play around with, leave them as defaults. They're typically not a problem to change. So we hit connect. And now we're connected to our SQL Server on this machine, our SQL Server Developer Edition. If you notice on the left over here, we have our database information, and we'll go over this more in our next lesson. But for now, I just want to make sure you realize we actually are connected to our database server and that everything is set up properly. All right, so that concludes this lesson. Thanks for watching.